The old piano's keys felt like home under Melody Chen's fingertips. Each note rang clear through the empty community center as afternoon sunlight streamed through dusty windows. 16 years old and small for her age, she sat with perfect posture, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Time disappeared when she played, the world shrinking to just her hands and the music. She hit a wrong note and winced. 2 weeks. That's all she had left before the regional piano competition. 2 weeks to perfect a piece that still fought against her fingers in the trickiest sections. 2 weeks to prove she deserved that music scholarship. Melody took a deep breath and started again from the beginning. The Chopin piece began softly, almost hesitantly, before building into a complex storm of notes that required both technical skill and emotional depth. Her piano teacher, Mrs. Winters, had chosen this piece specifically because it would challenge her. Too many young pianists pick flashy pieces to show off speed, Mrs. Winters had told her. This piece shows maturity. Maturity wouldn't pay for music school, though. Only winning would do that. Her parents had been clear. They supported her love of music, but college meant practical degrees. Business, accounting. Something with actual job prospects, as her father often said. The only way she'd attend the conservatory was with a scholarship, and this competition was her last chance. Melody closed her eyes, feeling the music rather than reading it. She'd memorized the piece weeks ago. Now it was about making it sing, about putting her heart into each. That's quite enough for today. The voice cut through her concentration like a knife, causing her to slam an awkward chord that echoed through the room. Melody spun around on the bench. A tall, thin man stood in the doorway. He wore an expensive gray suit that matched his steel gray hair, all straight lines and sharp angles. His face seemed permanently set in disapproval, with deep lines etched between his eyebrows and around his mouth. He carried a leather briefcase and looked at Melody as if she were something unpleasant he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "I'm sorry," she said, automatically apologizing, though she wasn't sure why. "The center's open until 6 and I reserved this room for practice." The man stepped further into the room. "I'm Judge Richard Harmon. The center is being prepared for the county judicial fundraiser tonight, and I need to review my speech." In silence, Melody recognized the name immediately. Everyone in town knew Judge Harmon, or knew of him. People called him the glacier behind his back, cold, unmoving, absolutely no sense of humor or compassion in his courtroom. Her cousin had gotten community service for a minor offense last year, and had described the judge as, like if winter could wear a tie. "I understand, sir," Melody said, trying to sound respectful. "But I really need this practice time. The competition is in 2 weeks, and..." "Young lady," he interrupted, checking his expensive watch. "Some of us have real responsibilities. Not hobby recitals." Melody felt her cheeks burn. "It's not a hobby. It's a competition for a college scholarship." Something flickered across the judge's face. Annoyance mostly, but perhaps a hint of something else. For a moment, Melody thought he might soften. Instead, he set his briefcase on a table and clicked it open. "Find somewhere else," he said without looking at her. "This room is needed for actual community business." Melody's hands curled into fists on her lap. The unfairness of it bubbled up inside her. She had reserved the space, had permission to be here, had been coming every Tuesday for months. But arguing with a judge seemed unwise, especially this judge. "I only need 30 more minutes," she tried again, hating how young her voice sounded. "Please. The acoustics here are perfect and my family's apartment is too small for a piano. I can play quietly while you work." Judge Harmon looked up from his papers, his pale blue eyes cold. "No, just that." A single word delivered like a verdict. Melody felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of this man. Slowly, deliberately, she gathered her sheet music, tucking it into her worn backpack. The community center had been her sanctuary, a place where she could practice without disturbing the neighbors in their thin-walled apartment building, without her little brother banging on the door asking when it would be his turn to use the room. As she closed the piano lid, she gave the keys one last longing look. Her fingers itched to finish the piece, to work through the tricky section she'd been stuck on. Now she'd have to find somewhere else, and options were limited in their small town. Judge Harmon had already spread his papers across a table, effectively dismissing her existence. "The senior center has a piano," he said unexpectedly, not looking up. And out of tune upright but functional. They close at 5. Was that supposed to be helpful? Melody checked her phone. It was already 4:15 and the senior center was across town. By the time she got there, she'd have maybe 20 minutes at most. Hardly worth the trip. Thank you for the suggestion, she said stiffly, shouldering her backpack. As she headed for the door, a flyer on the bulletin board caught her eye. The regional competition announcement with her name listed among the participants. She'd felt so proud seeing it there. Proof that she belonged among serious musicians. Now it felt like a mockery. Outside, the October air had turned cool as afternoon shifted toward evening. Melody pulled her thin jacket tighter and blinked against the bright slant of autumn sunlight. Where could she go now? The high school would be locked. The library had no piano. Home meant trying to practice on her electronic keyboard with headphones, which never felt the same as a real piano. She dug her phone from her pocket and texted her piano teacher. Judge Harmon kicked me out of the community center. Need new practice space, ideas? The reply came quickly. My house is full of relatives visiting this week. Try the courthouse? There's an old piano in jury room 3, often empty after 4. Melody stared at the message in surprise. The courthouse? That seemed risky. What if she ran into Judge Harmon again? But what choice did she have? She glanced back at the community center, where the windows now glowed with soft light. Through the glass, she could see people in formal attire beginning to arrive for the fundraiser. Men in suits and women in cocktail dresses, all there to support the judicial system, or at least to be seen supporting it. The same system that, in the person of Judge Harmon, had just dismissed her dreams as unimportant. With a sigh, Melody turned away and began walking toward the courthouse, 5 blocks over. Maybe she'd find an empty room with a piano. Maybe she'd get lucky. Behind her, in the community center, Judge Harmon stood at the window watching the young pianist leave. For a brief moment, something like regret crossed his features. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual stern expression as he turned to greet the first arriving guests. Judge Harmon, called the district attorney, approaching with a glass of wine already in hand. Ready for another thrilling evening of pretending to care about community outreach? Hardly, the judge replied dryly. But duty calls. You look even more sour than usual, the DA observed. Jury give you trouble today? Judge Harmon shook his head slightly. Just a teenager with a piano. Nothing important. But as the evening wore on and he delivered his practiced speech about the importance of community involvement in the judicial system, his thoughts kept drifting to the girl's face when he'd dismissed her practice as a hobby. There had been real pain there, and determination too. It reminded him of, he cut that thought off sharply. No point dwelling on the past. He'd built his reputation on being firm, fair, and unsentimental. Feelings had no place in his courtroom or his life. That's how it had been for 5 years now, and that's how it would stay. Meanwhile, across town, Melody climbed the courthouse steps, hope and worry battling within her. She needed to practice. She needed to win. And nothing, not even the coldest judge in the county, would stop her from trying. 3 days had passed since Melody's run-in with Judge Harmon, and she was no closer to finding a reliable place to practice. The senior center's piano had been so wildly out of tune that playing it had actually hurt her ears. The church pianist had let her use their space for one afternoon, but they had choir practice most evenings. Her school's music room was booked solid with band rehearsals for the upcoming fall festival. That left her with the electronic keyboard at home, which just wasn't the same. The touch, the feel, the sound, everything was slightly off. It was like trying to train for a swimming competition in a bathtub. Mom, I really need to find a piano, Melody said over breakfast, pushing cereal around her bowl. Dark circles had formed under her eyes from staying up late to practice after her little brother went to sleep. Her mother looked up from packing lunches, concern etched on her tired face. I know, honey. I wish we had room for a real one here. Their apartment was small, cozy, her mother called it, with thin walls and neighbors who complained about even the muted sound of her keyboard. A real piano had never been an option. What about your teacher, Mrs. Winters? Her father suggested, gulping down coffee before his early shift at the factory. Her cousin's family is staying with her all month. 7 people in a 2-bedroom house. Melody sighed. She offered to let me practice there anyway, but I could hear the chaos in the background when she called. Her father checked his watch and stood. "You'll figure something out." "You always do." He kissed the top of her head. "Just don't get any crazy ideas about breaking into places, okay?" Melody rolled her eyes. "Dad, I'm not going to break into anywhere." But as she walked to school that morning, the courthouse loomed in the distance, and she couldn't help wondering about that piano her teacher had mentioned. Jury room 3. Would anyone really mind if she just borrowed it for an hour or two? No, she shook her head. She wasn't that desperate. Not yet, anyway. The sky had been threatening rain all day. Dark clouds gathering and thickening as afternoon classes dragged on. Melody had been distracted, her fingers tapping out piano rhythms on her desk while her teachers droned on about equations and historical dates. Her mind kept circling back to the same problem. 11 days until the competition, and nowhere to practice properly. When school finally ended, fat raindrops had just begun to fall. She stood under the overhang, watching other students sprint to waiting cars or unfurl umbrellas. She'd forgotten hers, of course. The rain picked up quickly, turning from scattered drops to a proper downpour in minutes. Lightning flashed, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that made her jump. The courthouse was only 2 blocks away, closer than home and definitely closer than the community center. She pulled her jacket over her head and ran. By the time she reached the courthouse steps, she was soaked through. Water dripped from her hair, her clothes clung uncomfortably, and her backpack, containing all her sheet music, had gotten wet despite her efforts to shield it. Shivering, she pushed through the heavy doors into the building's grand entryway. The courthouse always made Melody nervous. Its high ceilings and marble floors turned every footstep into an echo, as if the building itself was listening to you. She'd only been here once before, when her class took a field trip to watch a trial for government class. That day, the place had been bustling with lawyers, defendants, police officers, and families. Now in the late afternoon, the lobby was nearly empty except for a sleepy-looking security guard. "Building's closing in an hour," he told her without looking up from his phone. "Court's done for the day." "I just need to wait out the storm," Melody said, waving toward the windows where rain lashed against the glass. "Maybe use the bathroom to dry off a bit." He grunted and pointed down a hallway. Melody nodded her thanks and headed that way, droplets of water marking her path on the polished floor. After doing her best to dry her hair with rough paper towels, Melody wandered back into the hallway. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Thunder boomed again, closer this time, and the lights flickered briefly. Almost without conscious decision, her feet carried her toward the back hallways where jury rooms were located. Just to look, she told herself. Just to see if there really was a piano there. The corridor was dimly lit and quiet, with numbered doors lining one side. Room 1, Room 2, there it was. Room 3. The door was unlocked, and Melody glanced over her shoulder before slipping inside. The room was small but formal, with a long table surrounded by chairs. And there in the corner sat an old upright piano. It wasn't anything special, just a worn instrument with yellowed keys and scuff marks along its wooden frame. But to Melody it looked like treasure. She approached it cautiously, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing down. Then, unable to resist, she played a soft C major chord. The sound was surprisingly warm and in tune. Melody felt a smile spread across her face, her first real smile in days. She sat on the bench, arranged her damp sheet music on the stand, and began to play quietly, just to test the instrument's response. It was lovely. Not perfect, but so much better than anything she'd had access to since being kicked out of the community center. Before she knew it, she'd launched into her competition piece, losing herself in the music. Judge Richard Harmon hated the rain. It made his bad knee ache, a souvenir from a skiing accident in his 30s. It also meant more traffic accidents, which meant more cases on his already overcrowded docket. But mostly, he hated how it made his empty house feel even emptier, the sound of water drumming on the roof amplifying the silence inside. So he stayed late at the courthouse, burying himself in case files long after his clerk had gone home. Work was a reliable anesthetic against thought, against feeling, and there was always more work to do. He rubbed his tired eyes and checked the time, nearly 6 p.m. He should go home. He should eat something. He should do many things that felt impossible since Eleanor had died. 5 years this Saturday. 5 years since cancer had taken his wife, leaving him alone in a house full of memories and music that had gone silent. The thought ambushed him, as it often did this time of year. He pushed it away and reached for another file. Then he heard it, faint but unmistakable. Piano music. At first he thought he was imagining things. It wouldn't be the first time his mind had played tricks on him when he was tired. But the melody continued, growing clearer as he listened. Someone was definitely playing the old piano in Jury Room 3. Irritation flared. The courthouse wasn't a music hall, but something about the piece caught his attention. It was Chopin, he realized. Nocturne in E-flat major. Eleanor's favorite. Without quite meaning to, he found himself walking toward the sound, drawn like a boat to a lighthouse. The piece was being played well. Not perfectly, but with genuine feeling. Through the partly open door, he could see a young girl at the piano, her dark hair still damp from the rain, her face absorbed in the music. It was the girl from the community center. The scholarship contestant, Judge Harmon, stood frozen in the hallway. He should stop her, should remind her that this was a courthouse, not a practice room. But the music held him there, stirring memories he usually kept carefully locked away. Eleanor at their piano, her honey-colored hair falling over her shoulders as she played this very piece. Eleanor taking his hand and trying to teach him, laughing at his clumsy attempts. Eleanor in her hospital bed, too weak to play anymore but still moving her fingers slightly in time with the recordings he brought her. The girl, Melody, he suddenly remembered, hit a difficult passage and faltered. She stopped, sighed, then tried again. And again. Her determination was familiar too. Eleanor had practiced that way, returning to troublesome measures over and over until they yielded to her will. As Judge Harmon watched from the shadows of the hallway, his usual coldness felt less like armor and more like a prison. The music unlocked something in him, not fully, just a small crack in the ice, but it was enough to make him lean against the wall and simply listen. Melody worked through the piece once more, then transitioned smoothly into another melody, something softer and more wistful. Judge Harmon didn't recognize it at first. Then it hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't Chopin anymore. It was Autumn Leaves in E minor, Eleanor's composition, the one she'd written during their first year together, before law school had consumed her creative time, the one she'd played for him on their anniversary each year, the one he hadn't heard since her funeral. His sharp intake of breath must have been audible because Melody suddenly stopped playing and spun around on the bench, eyes wide with alarm. "I'm sorry," she blurted. "I know I shouldn't be here. The rain and I needed somewhere to practice, and the door was open." But Judge Harmon barely heard her excuses. There was only one thought in his mind, pushing through the shock and confusion. "Where?" he asked, his voice hardly more than a whisper. "Did you learn that song?" Melody's heart pounded in her chest. Judge Harmon stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking her exit. But something was different about him. The cold, stern expression she remembered from the community center had been replaced by something she couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe, or pain. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice unsteady. "That song. The second one you played. Where did you learn it?" Melody swallowed hard. Was she in trouble? Would he report her for trespassing? Would this affect her scholarship chances? "My grandmother taught it to me," she said finally. "I'm sorry for being here." "I know I shouldn't." "Your grandmother," he interrupted. "What's her name?" The question caught her off guard. "Li Wei Chen. She taught piano at the college for 40 years before she retired." "Why?" Judge Harmon moved into the room slowly as if in a trance. He lowered himself into one of the jury chairs, suddenly looking much older than he had a moment ago. "That piece isn't published," he said quietly. "It was written by my wife, Eleanor." Melody's eyes widened. "Eleanor Harmon was your wife? The Eleanor who wrote Autumn Leaves in E minor?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on something far away. "She died 5 years ago." "I'm so sorry," Melody said automatically, then hesitated. "My grandmother always said it was the most beautiful love song she'd ever heard." "I didn't know. I mean, I never connected." "How could you have?" Judge Harmon said. He looked up at her, really seeing her for the first time. "Your grandmother. She was Eleanor's piano teacher, wasn't she?" Melody nodded. "For 3 years when my grandmother first started teaching at the college. She talks about Eleanor sometimes, says she was her most talented student." She paused, remembering. She said Eleanor gave up music to pursue law. A ghost of a smile touched the judge's lips. Not entirely by choice. Her parents thought law was a more practical career path. Sound familiar? Melody felt a jolt of recognition. My parents say the exact same thing. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the stern judge and the young pianist, connected by an unexpected thread of music and memory. Thunder rumbled outside, breaking the spell. Rain still lashed against the windows, turning the world beyond into a watery blur. "You should call your parents," Judge Harmon said, glancing at the storm. "Let them know where you are." Melody checked her phone. No signal. The storm must have knocked out a tower. Judge Harmon stood with a small sigh. "Come with me. You can use the landline in my chambers and I'll make us some tea while we wait out the storm." He paused, seeming surprised by his own words. "That is, if you'd like to. I have questions about the song." Melody hesitated only briefly before gathering her music. "I'd like that. And I have questions too, if that's okay." He nodded and led her down the hall to a door marked Judge Richard Harmon in gold lettering. His chambers were neat and formal, all dark wood, leather-bound books, and muted colors. Nothing personal on display, Melody noticed. No family photos, no mementos. Just law books and case files. Judge Harmon pointed to the phone on his desk, then disappeared through a side door. Melody called her mother, assuring her that she was safe at the courthouse waiting out the storm and would be home for dinner. When the judge returned, he carried 2 steaming mugs. "It's just chamomile," he said, handing her one. "I keep it for late nights." Melody accepted the tea gratefully, warming her hands around the mug. "Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them. The judge cleared his throat. "The song. How did you come to learn it?" Melody took a small sip before answering. "My grandmother has a collection of handwritten compositions. When I was little, she'd play them for me, and that one was always my favorite. After I started taking lessons from her, it was the first piece I begged her to teach me." She smiled at the memory. "I was probably 7 or 8. It was way too advanced for me then, but she gave me a simplified version. I've been playing it ever since." "When I'm nervous," she added, almost to herself. Judge Harmon raised an eyebrow. "You were nervous just now? In the jury room?" Melody nodded. "The competition's in 11 days, and I still don't have a reliable place to practice. Plus," she gestured vaguely toward the window, "storms make me jumpy." Understanding flickered in his eyes. Eleanor was the same way. About storms, I mean. It was the opening Melody had been waiting for. "What was she like, your wife?" For a moment she thought she'd gone too far. Judge Harmon's face seemed to close up, the familiar coldness returning. But then he sighed and the walls came down just a little. Eleanor was brilliant, passionate, stubborn, a faint smile. She cared about things deeply, fought for what she believed in. That's what made her such a good attorney. "You met in court?" Melody asked, remembering something her grandmother had mentioned once. Judge Harmon nodded. "She was opposing counsel on one of my first big cases as a prosecutor. She completely outmaneuvered me." His smile grew a little stronger at the memory. I was impressed. And a bit intimidated, if I'm being honest. Melody tried to imagine the stern, imposing judge being intimidated by anyone. It seemed impossible. "Did she keep playing piano? After she became a lawyer, I mean." "Yes and no," he replied. "Not professionally, of course, but we had a baby grand in our living room. She played nearly every evening after work. Said it helped her think through difficult cases." He paused, lost in memory. "She composed too, though not as much as she would have liked. Time was always in short supply." "Autumn Leaves is really beautiful," Melody said. "The way it builds from something so simple to that complex middle section, then returns to the theme but changed somehow." "I've never heard anything quite like it." Judge Harmon looked at her with sudden intensity. "You understand it? The structure, I mean." Eleanor said most people just heard the melody, but missed the architecture underneath. Melody felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. "My grandmother taught me to listen for the bones of a piece, not just its skin." "A good teacher," he said quietly. "The best," Melody agreed. "She doesn't take many students anymore. Her arthritis makes it too painful to demonstrate, but she still teaches me. Says I'm her legacy." The judge nodded slowly as if coming to a decision. "Would your grandmother be willing to meet with me?" "I'd like to thank her for preserving Eleanor's music." "I'm sure she would," Melody said. She speaks very highly of your wife." Another silence fell, but it was more comfortable this time. The storm continued outside, rain drumming steadily against the windows, but the thunder had moved off, just a distant rumble now and then. "May I ask you something, Judge Harmon?" He looked up from his tea. "You can call me Richard." "And yes, you may." "Richard?" she said, testing the name. "Why did you stop me from practicing at the community center?" "The real reason, I mean." He set his mug down carefully. "The fundraiser was just an excuse. The truth is," he paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "The truth is that hearing you play reminded me too much of Eleanor. Piano music, especially played well. It brings back memories I've been trying to avoid for 5 years." His honesty surprised her. "That must be hard." "It is," he admitted. "But perhaps it's time I stopped running from those memories." Eleanor wouldn't have wanted her music to die with her. He looked up at Melody. "She certainly wouldn't have wanted me to stop a young pianist from practicing for a scholarship competition." Melody smiled cautiously. "Does that mean I can go back to using the community center?" "It means," Richard said slowly, "that I think we can find you a better option than that old upright in the jury room." He hesitated. "Eleanor's piano, the baby grand, it's just sitting in our living room gathering dust." "It should be played," Melody's breath caught. "A baby grand? To practice on until the competition? Are you serious?" Richard nodded. "On one condition. What's that?" "You play Autumn Leaves for me again. The full version, not the simplified one. I'd like to hear it the way Eleanor meant it to be heard." Melody felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. "I'd be honored, but I don't have the sheet music with me. My grandmother keeps the original." "You don't need it," Richard said with certainty. "I've seen how you play. You know it by heart," and she did. As the storm began to clear outside, Melody followed Judge Harmon, Richard, back to the jury room, sat at the old upright piano, and played his wife's composition from memory. Every note, every nuance, every emotion she could draw from the worn keys. When she finished, she looked up to find the judge standing with his eyes closed, a single tear tracking down his weathered cheek. "Thank you," he whispered. The Harmon house stood at the end of Oak Lane, set back from the street behind a row of tall pines. It was larger than Melody had expected, a stately 2-story colonial with white columns and dark green shutters. The kind of house that appeared in magazines or movies, not the kind where real people lived except someone had lived here. Eleanor Harmon had filled these rooms with life and music before cancer took her away. Melody stood nervously on the front porch beside her grandmother, Lee Wei-chen. At 76, Grandma Lee was tiny but formidable, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her posture perfect despite the arthritis that gnarled her once nimble fingers. She clutched a worn leather folder to her chest, Eleanor's original compositions, carefully preserved for over 30 years. "You're fidgeting," Grandma Lee observed, her voice carrying the slight accent that 5 decades in America hadn't erased. "I'm nervous," Melody admitted. "What if he's changed his mind? About letting you practice here? Or about seeing me?" "Both, I guess." Her grandmother's eyes crinkled with amusement. "The Richard Harmon I remember was stubborn as a mountain. Once he made a decision, nothing moved him." She patted Melody's arm. "Besides, we bring gifts he cannot refuse." Before Melody could respond, the door opened. Judge Harmon stood there in casual clothes, khaki pants and a blue sweater instead of his usual suit. It made him look almost like a regular person, Melody thought. His eyes moved from Melody to her grandmother, and something like recognition flickered across his face. "Professor Chen," he said softly. "It's been a long time." Grandma Lee bowed her head slightly. "Too long, Mr. Harmon, and please, I am retired now. Just Lee Wei will do." "Then I'm just Richard," he replied, stepping back to usher them inside. "Please come in." The house was immaculate, everything polished and in its place like a museum rather than a home. Melody noticed there were no personal photos on display, just like in his chambers, no visual reminders of what he'd lost. He led them through to a large living room with tall windows overlooking a garden that had once been carefully tended, but now showed signs of neglect. And there, in the center of the room, stood a gorgeous baby grand piano, its black surface gleaming in the afternoon light. Melody couldn't help herself. She moved toward it like a moth to flame, running her fingertips lightly over its closed lid. "Steinway," her grandmother murmured appreciatively. "Model B, Eleanor always did have excellent taste." Richard nodded. "She saved for years before we were married." Said if she was giving up performing, she at least wanted a proper instrument at home. May I? Melody asked, gesturing to the piano. Please, Richard said. That's why you're here. Melody sat on the bench, lifted the fallboard, and revealed the pristine ivory keys beneath. She played a simple C major scale, then a chord progression. The sound was rich and resonant, filling the room with warmth. It's perfectly in tune, she said, surprised. I have it serviced twice a year, Richard replied. Eleanor would have haunted me if I'd let it deteriorate. The first hint of humor she'd heard from him. Melody smiled. Grandma Lee opened her leather folder and carefully extracted several handwritten sheets of music. I brought these for you, Richard. Copies of Eleanor's compositions. I thought you might like to have them. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the pages. Thank you. I don't have many of her compositions. She kept them at her office, and after she died, I couldn't bear to... He trailed off, his composure slipping. Grief makes us do strange things, Grandma Lee said gently, or not do them, as the case may be. Richard cleared his throat. Would you both like some tea? Or coffee? Tea would be lovely, Grandma Lee said. I'll help, Melody offered, following him to the kitchen. As he filled a kettle, she noticed a small photograph tucked beside the microwave, the only personal touch she'd seen in the house so far. A younger Richard Harmon stood beside a beautiful woman with honey-colored hair and bright eyes, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's view. Is that Eleanor? She asked softly. Richard glanced at the photo. Yes, our 10th anniversary. We went to Vancouver. A small smile. One of the happiest weeks of my life. Melody studied the woman who had written the haunting melody that had brought them all together. She looks kind. She was, Richard said simply. Kinder than I deserved most days. They carried tea and cookies back to the living room, where they found Grandma Lee seated at the piano, her twisted fingers moving slowly over the keys, picking out a simple melody. I hope you don't mind, she said, looking up. It's been years since I played a Steinway. Not at all, Richard said, setting down the tray. It should be played. They settled with their tea, and for a while the three of them just talked. Richard asked Grandma Lee about her teaching years, about her memories of Eleanor as a student. Grandma Lee shared stories that made him laugh and sometimes blink away tears. Melody mostly listened, fascinated by this softer version of the stern judge she'd first met. She was so gifted, Grandma Lee said. Not just technically, many students have good technique, but she understood music's soul. When she played Chopin or Debussy, you forgot she was a 20-year-old student. You felt you were hearing the composer's own thoughts. Richard nodded. That's what drew me to her, though I didn't understand it then. I heard her play at a faculty recital. I was there with a friend who'd dragged me along. I knew nothing about classical music, but when Eleanor played, he shook his head, remembering. I had to meet her. And the rest is history, Grandma Lee said with a smile. Not right away, Richard admitted. I made a fool of myself trying to impress her with what little I knew about music. She saw right through me. Yet she married you anyway, Grandma Lee teased. Eventually, after I stopped pretending and just told her the truth, that her music moved me like nothing else ever had. Melody watched the two of them talking, sharing memories of a woman who had clearly meant the world to both of them in different ways. She felt privileged to witness it, this gentle unfolding of grief and remembrance. Eventually, the conversation circled back to Melody's upcoming competition. 9 days. Her grandmother reminded her. You should practice while we're here. Richard straightened. Yes, of course. That's why you came. Please, Melody, play whatever you need to work on. Don't mind us old folks reminiscing. Melody returned to the piano bench and arranged her competition piece on the music stand. She played through it once, allowing herself to enjoy the Steinway's responsive action and rich tone. Again, Grandma Lee instructed when she finished. The middle section needs work. Your left hand is rushing. For the next hour, Melody practiced while her grandmother offered occasional guidance. Richard sat quietly, listening with his eyes closed. At one point, Melody glanced over and saw tears on his cheeks, but he made no move to wipe them away. When she finally stopped, her fingers tired but happy, he opened his eyes and nodded. You play beautifully, he said. Eleanor would have loved to hear you. Coming from him, it was high praise indeed. As the afternoon light began to fade, Grandma Lee announced it was time to leave. May we return tomorrow? She asked Richard. Melody needs regular practice on a proper instrument before the competition. Of course, he said immediately. Come whenever you like. I'll give you a key. Melody's eyes widened. Really, a key to your house? He nodded. I'm at the courthouse most days. This way you can practice even when I'm not here. He hesitated. On one condition. What's that? Melody asked, remembering his previous condition about playing Eleanor's song. Sometimes, I'd like to listen. If that's all right with you. Something in his voice made Melody's heart ache. How long had it been since music had filled this house? 5 years of silence must have been its own kind of torture for someone who had loved a musician. I'd like that, she said simply. Over the next week, a routine developed. Melody would go to school, then come straight to the Harmon house to practice. Sometimes Grandma Lee joined her, sometimes not. Richard would return from the courthouse in the early evening and sit quietly in an armchair, listening as she played. Occasionally he'd share another memory of Eleanor, each story like a small piece of a puzzle gradually forming a picture of the woman who had connected them all. 3 days before the competition, as Melody was gathering her things to leave, Richard stopped her. There's something I want to show you, he said. Follow me. He led her upstairs to a small room she hadn't seen before. Inside was a desk, a bookshelf, and a filing cabinet. Eleanor's home office, she realized. Richard opened a drawer in the filing cabinet and removed a small box. From it, he took a simple silver bracelet with a single charm, a miniature piano. Eleanor wore this for luck at every recital from the time she was your age, he said. She'd want you to have it for your competition. Melody stared at the bracelet, stunned by the gesture. I couldn't possibly, please, Richard said. It's been sitting in this box for 5 years. She loved music too much to have her lucky charm locked away forever. He held it out, and after a moment's hesitation, Melody accepted it. I'll take good care of it, she promised, and return it after the competition. Richard shook his head. It's yours now. Eleanor would want it that way. As she slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, Melody felt the weight of it, not just the silver, but the history, the connection, the trust being placed in her. Thank you, she whispered, blinking back tears. Richard nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Now go home and rest. Big day coming up. The morning of the competition arrived with clear skies and golden autumn sunshine. A perfect day, if not for the butterflies swarming in Melody's stomach. She'd barely slept, running through her piece in her mind over and over, imagining her fingers on Eleanor's piano, even as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She'd practiced until her parents had insisted she come home the night before. Richard had been there for her final run-through, sitting quietly in his usual armchair, eyes closed as he listened. When she finished, he'd simply nodded and said, You're ready. Now, standing backstage at the Westfield Performing Arts Center, Melody wasn't so sure. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see the auditorium filling with people, parents, teachers, judges, other contestants. The scholarship committee sat in the front row with clipboards and serious expressions. Melody touched Eleanor's bracelet on her wrist, drawing comfort from the cool silver. Her name would be called soon. She was contestant number 7 out of 12. Enough time to get over the initial nerves, her grandmother always said, but not so long that fatigue would set in. Melody, she turned to find her parents and grandmother approaching, their faces a mixture of pride and concern. How are you feeling, honey? Her mother asked, straightening Melody's collar needlessly. Nervous, Melody admitted. But okay, I think. Her father squeezed her shoulder. You'll do great. All those hours of practice will pay off. Grandma Lee studied her face. Remember what I always tell you. Melody smiled despite her nerves. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about making people feel something. Her grandmother nodded approvingly. And you, my little songbird, have always been good at that part. A competition official appeared with a clipboard. 15 minutes, Melody. You should take your seat in the waiting area now. Her family wished her luck and headed to their seats. As Melody turned to follow the official, she caught sight of someone unexpected entering the auditorium. Judge Richard Harmon, looking slightly out of place in his usual formal suit among the more casually dressed families. He hadn't mentioned he would come. Somehow, knowing he was there both increased her nervousness and settled it at the same time. One more person to play for, but also someone who understood what the music meant to her. Backstage, Melody sat with the other contestants, all of them silent and tense. Some flipped through sheet music, others closed their eyes in concentration. A boy 2 seats down kept cracking his knuckles until the girl beside him shot him a murderous look. Contestant number 4 was playing now, a tall girl with perfect posture who was tackling a difficult Liszt piece. Even through the curtains, Melody could hear how skillfully she played. Her palms began to sweat. She wiped them on her skirt, then reached again for Eleanor's bracelet, turning the little piano charm between her fingers. What would Eleanor think of her playing her favorite Chopin piece? Would she approve of Melody's interpretation? Contestant number 7, Melody Chen, called the announcer. Melody stood on legs that suddenly felt like water. She made her way to the stage, the spotlight blinding her momentarily. As her eyes adjusted, she could just make out her family in the 3rd row. And there, a few seats away, the unmistakable figure of Richard Harmon. She sat at the gleaming concert grand, adjusted the bench, and took a deep breath. The familiar ritual calmed her. This was what she'd been working toward for months. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips, so different from Eleanor's piano yet somehow connected to it. Then she began to play. The first notes of the Chopin Nocturne filled the auditorium. Soft and tentative, like the beginning of a question, Melody felt her nerves fade as the music took over, her fingers finding their way through the familiar landscape of the piece. The middle section arrived, the part she'd struggled with for so long, and suddenly she heard Eleanor's voice in her head. Not her actual voice, which Melody had never heard, but what she imagined it might be. Music isn't just notes on a page. It's the space between the notes. It's what you don't play that matters as much as what you do. Words her grandmother had attributed to Eleanor during one of their conversations at Richard's house. Words that made sense now, as Melody shaped the phrases with new understanding. The piece built toward its climax, passion rising through her fingers into the keys. Melody closed her eyes, seeing in her mind the image of Eleanor at this very piano, Richard listening from his armchair, the two of them connected by music in a way words could never capture. Then the final section, returning to the opening theme but transformed, wiser somehow, more settled. As the last notes faded into silence, Melody realized there were tears on her cheeks. The audience erupted in applause, startling her out of the trance-like state. She stood, bowed, and left the stage, her heart pounding not from nerves now but from the pure emotional release of the performance. Backstage, she sat in a daze, barely registering the performances that followed. When all 12 contestants had played, they were called back to the stage for the announcement of the results. Melody stood in line with the others, Eleanor's bracelet clasped tightly in her palm. She had done her best. Whatever happened now, she had played with her whole heart, and that was what mattered. The head judge, a stern-looking woman with steel-gray hair, stepped to the microphone. Before we announce the scholarship recipients, I want to thank all our contestants for their outstanding performances today. The level of talent has been exceptional. Melody's heart hammered in her chest. She searched the audience, finding her family's anxious faces, then Richard's. Unlike everyone else, he looked perfectly calm, as if he already knew what was coming. Third place, with a scholarship of $1,000, goes to... Melody held her breath. Thomas Winters, for his performance of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. A boy at the end of the line stepped forward to accept his certificate. 2 more to go. Second place with a scholarship of $5,000. Melody closed her eyes. Melody Chen, for her performance of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Second place. Not first, but second. Enough for a partial scholarship. Enough to make conservatory possible with some student loans and part-time work. She stepped forward in a daze, accepted her certificate, and returned to her place in line as first place was announced, the tall girl who had played Liszt. After the ceremony, the lobby buzzed with conversations, congratulations, and the occasional disappointed tears. Melody's parents embraced her, her mother openly crying with pride. Second place, her father kept saying. My daughter won second place. Her grandmother simply squeezed her hand. You played beautifully. Not perfect, but beautiful, Melody smiled. That's what matters, right? Over her grandmother's shoulder, she spotted Richard standing awkwardly at the edge of the crowd. She excused herself and made her way to him. You came, she said. He nodded. I wouldn't have missed it. Thank you. For everything. The piano, the bracelet, listening to me practice. You played. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. You played it the way Eleanor would have. With heart. Coming from him, it was the highest praise possible. Second place isn't so bad, Melody said, looking down at her certificate. It's excellent, Richard corrected. But even if you hadn't placed at all, what you've accomplished is remarkable. Melody raised an eyebrow. What's that? His gaze moved past her to where her family stood watching them curiously. You reminded an old man that life doesn't stop when we lose someone we love. That beauty continues even in the silence. Melody felt tears threatening again. Eleanor's music deserved to be heard. Yes, he agreed quietly. It did. An awkward moment passed, neither quite sure what to say next. Their unlikely friendship had been built around the competition, around Eleanor's piano and her music. With that chapter closing, what came next? Richard cleared his throat. I've been thinking. That jury room piano is woefully underused and your community center practice slot is hardly adequate. Melody waited, not quite understanding where he was going. What if, he continued, we established a proper music room at the courthouse? The old storage area on the second floor could be converted. We could move the jury room piano there, add some soundproofing, for me to practice in. Melody asked, confused. For you, yes, but also for others like you. Young musicians who need space and a decent instrument. He looked almost embarrassed by the idea. Eleanor always talked about doing something like that. I think it's time. Understanding dawned. A music scholarship? In Eleanor's name? Richard nodded. Starting with the remainder of your tuition. If you're amenable, of course. Melody stared at him, speechless. It was far more than she had ever expected. I can't accept, she began. You can, and you will, he interrupted, a flash of the stern judge returning briefly. Then his expression softened. Consider it Eleanor's legacy. Music was her first love. It should be her lasting one, too. Melody's family joined them, curious about the lengthy conversation. As Richard explained his proposal, Melody touched the piano charm on her bracelet, thinking of the woman who had once worn it, whose music had changed not just her life but Richard's as well. 6 months later, the Eleanor Harmon Music Room opened at the county courthouse. The plaque beside the door read, Where words fail, music speaks. Inside a baby grand piano, not Eleanor's, which remained in Richard's living room where Melody still came to practice twice a week, sat waiting for young musicians to bring it to life. And in a small college town 3 hours away, Melody Chen unpacked her belongings in a dormitory room, Eleanor's bracelet still on her wrist, ready to begin her first year at the conservatory. In her suitcase lay a folder of sheet music, copies of Eleanor's compositions that her grandmother and Richard had decided should finally be published. With proceeds going to the scholarship fund, the music had found its way home at last.